Oh, well, it's delivered at, let me tell you from personal experience, Internode, which is an Australian company, very innovative, is delivering it on the York Peninsula in South Australia, and they're getting 25 kilometres from the base station. Yeah. So this is why it's so superior.
To distance. She avoided the question then by moving from speed to distance.
If we can talk about the 12 megabits per second.
Well, we'll talk about speed and distance, but the reason why WiMAX is such a nimble, flexible technology and is superior to something that has to be in the ground is because it pushes much further from a base station, and this company is getting 25 kilometres from the base station now, today, in Australia. And of course it's being rolled out in 35 countries around the world. This is cutting-edge technology, and even poor old Steve the other day said he was a fan of WiMAX because he knows he can't cover 100% of the population unless he uses some sort of wireless component.
Is that right, Senator Conroy? Will you have to use WiMAX?
Look, there are so many things that are technically wrong with what Helen has just said. Internode are not suggesting they can get 12 megs, 25 kilometres. That is just a lie. Internode can't get 12 megs, 20 kilometres. The Minister continues to rewrite the laws of physics. Just very quickly for the Minister, the thing about wireless and why it's not superior, as she just claimed, to fibre technology, is it's a shared usage. If you and I both log on to a wireless service at the same time, guess what happens to our speed? It gets slower. If two people log on to fibre connections, guess what? It doesn't get slower because it's not shared. It's a dedicated line. So claims by Helen that she can deliver 12 megs through WiMAX, if she was a business, Graham Samuel would fine her for false and misleading advertising. He requires Internode, he requires Opel, he requires every wireless provider to use the words up to 12 megs.
Let's get a response then on the science there and the claims that...
OK, well look, I actually go to science. I don't just make claims without there being some foundation. And the claims for the WiMAX rollout that the government is now rolling out as we speak as a fully costed solution for people who've been waiting for that kind of speed and coverage across rural and regional Australia, is that it's actually been tested by an independent lab, and we have received very clear scientific advice that the claims for coverage, speed and propagation will all be met.
Well, let me just respond to that briefly, because the Institute of Public Affairs, not a known socialist supporter, not a known left-wing organisation,
not an expert in
they examined the science. They went and hired some experts, and the Institute of Public Affairs, a right-wing conservative think tank, said the government cannot deliver 50% of the coverage it claims because of the laws of physics.
Well, look, I pretend
Shara Evans from Market Clarity
on an expert instead of somebody from the Institute of Public Affairs.
I think we're getting to the point where we're each quoting different sources, and this could probably continue. But aside from the Opel network in the regional areas, as for the network that you're promising for city areas, you're saying no government investment.
We don't need to, because...
Well, but why haven't we seen it already happen? Why hasn't Telstra or G9 already built it? What's going to make them do it?
They said they don't want money. First of all, they've taken out full-page ads. They should have said, "Dear Steve Conroy, we don't need $4.7 billion of taxpayers' money, but we do need some assistance with the regulatory arrangements that will provide the incentive we want, the return we need to actually make a $5 billion investment of our own."
You're going to make that happen?
And what I've said we would do as part of this expert task force that's well advanced and that Steve's going to scrap, send us all back to the future, is we will look at what to do about an overbuild. We will cut through on prices. Instead of sending everybody back to the ACCC, we will legislate some prices over the life of the investment, so there'll be certainty, and we will actually be able to get going. I'll be able to make a decision by about no later than May next year, and we will seriously be able to get on with it.
And Stephen Conroy, you intend to fund part of your broadband plan by rating the Rural Telecommunications Fund. The NFF, the Farmers Federation, have been very critical of that. It's a fund that does provide ongoing revenue for upgrades in technology. So how are you going to ensure that the bush doesn't miss out on future technology improvements?
Let me be clear about this. The National Farmers Federation and Helen Coonan have put in place a program that will take 35 years. 35 years of the Communications Fund spending to match Labor's commitment to deliver up front. 35 years of spending out of the Communications Fund will match Labor's commitment up front to deliver these technologies.
That doesn't include the $1 billion that's been put into the regional fund by the government.
This is the $2 billion.
Steve's got very confused
let's get a quick
about
answer to
this.
that.
Steve has got terribly confused about this. The Communications Fund is not just for broadband, for heaven's sake. It's for mobiles, it's for TV black spots, and it's to make sure that we continue to push towers into the last 1% of the population that won't be reached by the 99% coverage of the current network. It's not to actually provide primary services. Everyone will be covered with broadband by no later than mid-2009. This is if there are some further upgrades that become appropriate. We've got a regional telecommunication committee going around now looking at how to spend the first $400 million from the fund.
This is just another pork barrel exercise, just like the Auditor General exposed yesterday. This is nothing more than photo opportunities for Helen, Coonan and the National Party ministers around the country to pretend they're actually fixing things. They're putting band-aids. This is their 18th plan, this fibre in the cities. 18th broadband plan in 11 and a half years, and we've actually not gone anywhere. Our broadband performance continues to lag the world.
All right, I want to move on from broadband, but just very quickly, Minister.
Just on the point that Stephen was making quite incorrectly, that, we'll go to where we are in the OECD ratings because we've gone up, but the point about it is the 400 million hasn't been spent. So, I mean, how Steve could, I think that's quite offensive to be suggesting that there'd be some inappropriate use of $400 million when this is important for rural and regional Australians, and far from having 18 broadband plans, the sorts of things that Steve doesn't appreciate is that we have, for instance, as one of those programs, we've done things like make sure that untimed local calls can be available to kids so that they can do their two-way lessons out in the bush. I mean, for goodness sake, you develop programs
I'm going to have to respond. I know you want to move on.
But
Helen Coonan has been having terrible trouble with the OECD and his statistics in recent years.
And we've just trumped you well and truly.
And what the minister did was to get her department to actually send material that the department extrapolated on figures. It didn't want to use the ABS. The ABS have disowned the figures that have been sent to the OECD. Okay. Well, so the only way we've improved on broadband performance in the OECD figures is because the minister and her department actually doctored them.
All right. Well, I think we could go round and round on broadband for another half an hour, but let's move on. We'll have to move on.
But David, look, it isn't fair. I mean, we have now rocketed up the league.
Okay.
We've gone from 21 to 12.
Let's not forget we do have questions to each other at the end.
6 for affordability,
and closing
9
statements.
for download speeds.
I'll invite you to return to it then.
And I know that Steve doesn't like this because he used to think he had a winner, but he's just lost it. We have now got into a position where we're even ahead of the United States.
We will have an opportunity at the end for further questions to each other, so I wouldn't be surprised if broadband pops up then. But let's move on to media. Now, the government made some significant reforms to media ownership rules recently. Stephen Conroy, you said at the time that you wanted to give the ACCC more power to force media companies to sell assets if competition is an issue there. Is that right? And what does that mean?
To promote diversity, and we'll be having more to say about this next week in terms of our communications policy, but to promote diversity, what we want to see is more powers for the ACCC so that they have divestiture powers. So if the concentrations become too great, they can actually deal with it. At the moment, they're toothless.
So Telstra could be told to sell Foxtel?
If they breached the concentration questions, that would be something the ACCC could look at. But at the moment, if there is a breach of the laws, the ACCC don't have the powers to do anything. So we're saying you've got to give them more powers. We want a national interest test because the Trade Practices Act is not sufficient by itself to protect diversity. What we want to see is a firm switch-off date for the analogue TV, a firm switch-off date. What we want to see is that there should be a number of options considered for what you do with the analogue spectrum after that switch-off. And one of those should be whether or not we have a fourth free-to-air television.
All right. Just on the firmer powers for the ACCC, is that a good idea, Minister?